What's up guys, it's Rowan and Terry here from ArtofSmartTV and welcome to the first official episode of the HSC Economics Review, or HER for short. Now HER, HSC Economics Review, is an Australian first web series for HSC Economics students that looks at the major global and Australian economic updates and provides you with the insights that you need to apply these real-world economic updates to the HSC Economic course so that you can nail that Band 6 result. Now in today's episode, Terry and I are going to be discussing the federal budget. With an election around the corner, spending, Libs and Labor, just throwing the cash out. The budget is a pretty big issue right now. And we're going to be looking at in particular how it impacts economic growth, because most of you would have recently finished economic growth as part of the course at school, and economic growth is going to continue to feature as a major issue throughout the rest of the course. So why is this important, right? Why is it important to be able to understand the federal budget and analyse its impact on economic growth? Well, we've got to start with the end in mind, and the end fundamentally is your HSC Economics exam. And a really typical question that Terry and I see come up with high frequency, be it at trials or in the HSC, is a question that says, to these lines, there's variations of it, but analyse the effectiveness of government macroeconomic policies in achieving economic objectives. Now, macroeconomic policy includes fiscal policy, and economic objectives includes economic growth. So you can see that if we start with the end in mind, being able to analyse the budget and its impact on economic growth is actually going to be super valuable for you by the time you get into your trials and HSC exams. So what we want to focus on is analysis, because we find that students really struggle with analysis. Yes, you can state the policy, but how do you actually go from policy to explain impact and then to talk about maybe why that impact is more or less likely or not? And so our goal here is really to give you some deeper insight. So to kick it off, we've got to start with, well, the budget itself. So Terry, what's the current budget outcome and stance that the federal government's put forward?
So the expected budget outcome for the 2019-2020 financial year is that the coalition government is expecting to provide a mildly contractionary budget with a return to surplus. Now, Rowan, what does a return to surplus mean, and why is this so important for this government?
So a return to surplus means that they're looking to take it to roughly a $7.1 billion surplus. So that essentially means, right, that revenue is greater than expenditure if we look at it at a really basic level. But it's really critical for this budget because it's an election year, right? So because it's an election year, the federal government is really trying to look at how do they showcase their economic management skills, right? They've had a leadership spill, confidence is low in the government right now, and the main thing that Liberals as a coalition have is their economic credentials, right? The credentials that they have in being good economic managers of the economy. And so as a result, we can see that this proves to be a really critical linchpin in their overall budget, which is getting it to a surplus for this coming financial year. Now, the interesting thing is this the first surplus that we've had for quite some time, Terry?
I believe it's going to be the first surplus in 10 years?
Yeah, so it's the first surplus since the GFC, right?
Yeah. And with that in mind, it's very optimistic, I've got to say, because they're expecting very, very much higher economic growth than what we've currently experienced. And that's a fundamental to that. Again, going back to what Rowan was saying earlier, they're expecting revenues to be a lot higher than probably what it might end up being.
And so part of that is, I guess if we dig into it a little bit, the government, when they're putting their budget together, are putting economic forecasts. Okay, and so what they've done is they've put some forecasts around economic growth. And so, what they've identified is they've said, we expect economic growth at the end of, the 2018-19 financial year to be roughly 2.25%. Okay, so 2.25, but we're going to expect that it's going to hit 2.75%, right? So a 0.5% growth for the 2019-2020 year, and it's going to stay like that until 2021, where it's going to go to 3%. So they've based their forecast here on, and their whole budget outcome and this surplus on the assumption that economic growth is going to get better. And so I guess my question, Terry, is, what has our economic growth been like, and is that a fair assumption for them to make?
So since the early 1990s, when we finished having our 1990-91 recession, Australia has averaged around 3.5% economic growth from that until 2016. And that was obviously propped up by things like the mining investment boom, the commodities boom. But since then, mining investment has slowed down significantly. And so the question has to be asked, what does this government believe will be the key driver of this economic growth, considering the fact that we have also experienced very low wage growth, as well as low consumer confidence in general.
And I think what's interesting is if we look at last year's figures, right? I mean, ultimately the best way to get a sense of future performance from a forecasting point of view is to look at past trends, right? Which is exactly what Terry's been sharing. If we look at the economic growth for 2018, where the year ended was with not so great economic growth. Like economic growth was 2.3%. So it was just above the 2.25% that the government is expecting, right, that economic growth will be at by the end of, June, essentially. But what's interesting is that it started 2018 much stronger. Economic growth at the beginning of 2018 was 2.8%. So we've seen economic growth in 2018 go from 2.8 down to 2.3, and then we've got a surplus budget. And so the point here is that a surplus budget, as Terry highlighted, is mildly contractionary. So the idea is that it's actually taking a little bit of steam out of the economy. And so if economic growth is 2.3 at the moment, and the government's saying we're going to run a surplus budget, mildly surplus, right? Mildly contractionary, it's a small surplus, wafer thin, it's not really going to grow the economy, okay, on that basis. But somehow the government's expecting, right, maybe a miracle, maybe some other things are going to happen, that we're going to see economic growth move to 2.75%. So what's some of the things that the government's hoping is going to happen that's going to somehow get us from 2.3 to 2.75?
Well, the first thing I want to look at is that as consumption is typically treated as about 60% of aggregate demand in the economy, they're expecting the wage price index to grow, which is basically people are going to be making more money from more income from their jobs. They're expecting to pick up from 2.75% through the year to the June quarter of 2020 with 3.25%. Now, wage growth, as you probably have heard, has been very, very slow recently. And so it remains to be seen, why does the government actually believe this is going to happen?
And so I think that's a really critical point, right? Because ultimately, so much of our economic growth is hinged on household spending, right? So household spending is really important. Now, to put a positive in for the government here, because it's going to sound like we're tearing this budget to shreds, and we are a little. Part of wage growth potentially as a very short-term hit is ultimately there will be, there has been some significant personal income tax cuts that the government is putting through. So those personal income tax will grow disposable income for households, which may lead to an increase in household spending, right? Which could be a factor that the budget is relying upon to prop up and continue to try to say that we're going to see a growth in household, spending. But I think the truth is that if we look at, again, 2018, the last budget had tax cuts, okay? Again, the tax cuts were provided, but household spending remained weak. Like at the end of the year, it actually had fallen a little. And so overall, we've got this situation where, last year the tax cuts didn't really change the game for household spending anyway. And this year, it doesn't look like it. Like, why would there be any difference? Even if there was, I think Terry's point is there's still a big difference between where we are now for household spending and where the government's predicting, and where we are right now for wage growth and where the government's predicting us to get to. So what this highlights in many respects, I think, is just that, there's some really big concerns here. We've got, pretty soft household spending. We've got pretty soft wage growth. This is going to mean that, household spending and consumption are going to remain fairly weak. So this isn't going to be able to drive the economic growth necessarily that the budget's predicting, and their tax cuts are probably not going to get there. So what else is the budget maybe hoping on? Because I think there's a couple of other things, that, from business investment to the global economy that they're hoping are going to come good for them.
So I'll just tackle that business investment point first. So the government's expecting business investment to rise significantly from just 1% to 5% and then finally to 4.5% in 2020-21. And underpinning this assumption is that they have upped their business asset write-off from 20,000 to 30,000. They've also extended the period for which small businesses can lodge for an additional 12 months. And the other thing is there's just been historically low interest rates due to the cash rate staying at 1.5% for, I believe, now 30 months. So if those two factors have really given the government a bit of room to be very aggressive with their business investment predictions. But Rowan, do you believe that this is grounded in any way?
I think aggressive is a good way to describe it, Terry. I think it's incredibly aggressive because if we put it in context, 30 months of 1.5% cash rate, business investment's been at 1%. What's going to change again? Why is all of a sudden business investment going to jump from 1 to 4% just because interest rates stay low? Additionally, I think with the asset write-off, a $20,000 to $30,000, an increase of $10,000 isn't that significant to cause such a lift, a 4% lift in business investment. Sure, it may cause it to lift a little, which is great, but certainly not to the extent the government's predicting. So once again, I feel like we've got an issue where the government's saying, well, you know what, we can run a surplus budget, which is mildly contractionary because all of these things are going to happen, which are going to make growth amazing. Yeah. And I'm not seeing it. I'm really not seeing business investment being anywhere near what the government is claiming.
I think they're just jumping the gun a bit. Like, they're assuming that these things are going to happen and then they can pull back a little bit with their mildly contractionary budget. But at the same time, if they don't actually stimulate the economy, how are we going to get to those numbers in the first place?
That's right. And it's a little bit of a trick. And that's where what's interesting is speaking about stimulation for the economy. One of the things this budget does feature very heavily on, I think, is infrastructure spending. And what we have seen is that in 2018, when the business investment remained flat, what was really interesting was public demand, which is essentially government investment in infrastructure, that picked up the slack. So the overall sort of steady improvements in business investment wasn't really a result of private business investment. It was a result of public investment. And so I think that's perhaps maybe where the government's really expecting to see business investment to be growing, because they're sort of shoring it up, so to speak, because they're making some significant investments in infrastructure. What sort of investments have they been looking to make, Terry?
Well, they've pledged an additional $10 billion into what they've already pledged into investments. A couple of key highlights here that I've got are they're looking to bring another $1.5 billion into the National Stronger Regions Fund, which is for urban and regional communities. They've also looked to improve regional airport upgrades, okay, with $100 million. But the big one for me, Rowan, is the Road of Strategic Importance funding, which is an increase from 3.5 billion to 4.5 billion.
And so the hope here, and once again, it's a lot to rely upon. The hope really is that this public investment is going to really support the overall investment in the economy and produce some growth. But what's interesting is most of these projects are continuations. Yeah. Most of these are, we're going to add some more money to what we're already spending. And again, that highlights for me a concern, because what they've already been spending has not been producing the stimulus that's been required. We saw growth go from 2.8 to 2.3. Is it going to necessarily change by topping up a little bit more, right? I'm skeptical. So again, we're sort of left with, well, what else are they relying upon to grow, the economy? And I think the big one is the global economy. There's estimates that, global economic conditions influence up to 60% of the conditions we experience in Australia. So surely then, out of all of these concerns we have, maybe we can rely on the global economy and China, right? We've been doing that for 10 years anyway, yeah, ever since GFC, and maybe that's what's happening here. But I guess my question is, what are global conditions really like? Are they crash hot? Are they slam dunk?
So even though Australia's main trading partners are performing slightly better than the rest of the world as a whole has suffered from a lot of just tension, I believe, with the rest of the globe. So you've got the China and US trade war, you've got civil unrest in Europe, in France in particular. And so the global economy hasn't been performing that well. And so we believe...
I think just to add, because I think there's even more than that. I think the UK's in a mess. I was going to say a Mexit, but they're in a mess with Brexit. That's created a whole lot of uncertainty. And yeah, we don't trade with the UK as much, but it still has impacts, you know, and I think on top of that, Italy's got a whole fiscal crisis right now, and so I mean, it sort of says, well, like there's some bad stuff going on globally. I mean, and what about China? I mean, where's their economic growth rate? I mean, that's so critical for us.
Well, hopefully you remember from everyone doing their case studies on China that China's growth rate has been slowing down to, I believe, around the 6% mark, whereas it used to average around 10%. So it has slowed down significantly, and therefore our exports have similarly suffered as a result.
Yeah, so it's interesting, you know, they posted, I think, 6.6% growth. They're predicted to land somewhere between 6 and 6.5. And you know, what's crazy is that's the lowest growth that they've recorded in almost 3 decades. So we're sort of saying, you know what, like we're wanting a strong global economy because that's what's going to prop up our economic growth here, because the budget isn't. But at the same time, when we take a closer look at the global economy, China's economic growth is slowing. In fact, you know, the IMF reduced their growth estimates 3 times, I think, or 2 or 3 times last year for global economic growth. You know, they proceeded to constantly reduce it because they looked at the globe and said, well, you know what, there's an acceleration of a slowdown. And so, you know, looking at that, what that tells me is, well, like the trends are going the wrong way. If the trends in growth were going up globally, you could be aggressive and optimistic as a federal government in putting your budget together, but they're going the other way. You know, the global trends are sort of going downwards, which means, you know, honestly, we're sort of in this position where maybe the federal budget is not doing enough work in supporting economic growth in Australia. Right? I mean, as an overall conclusion, I mean, what's your thoughts? You know, does the budget need to do more?
Well, I think we should just be mindful of the fact that this is an election year budget, and oftentimes they can be very optimistic and promise more than they end up delivering. As optimistic as this is, the coalition still has to actually win the election in order to pass this through Parliament as well.
So what that means, fun little fact, is that, you know, there might be an entirely new budget that comes through as a result of the election results, with an entirely different set of impacts on the economy. And I think, you know, it's interesting, the Australian Financial Review, the AFR, they identified really that this was a vote-buying budget. You know, really, it's all about the election, and so it's really why this positive story is being told. You know, I think the truth is that the budget probably really needs to be still a deficit. You know, it still needs to be, you know, mildly expansionary given what we're seeing globally. You know, it's not like the budget can rely on interest rates and the cash rate to do more of the work, because it's already on the floor, 1.5%. It can't go much lower. And so, you know, the issue is that, yes, I think the budget probably should be doing a little bit more, right? It probably should be doing a little bit more to prop up economic growth instead of prioritizing external stability, which is, you know, the attempts to get to surplus, reduce the debt, which is, you know, all the messaging of the budget. But yes, the big limitation here, the really big limitation in analysing the budget is that it is an election year. And ultimately, that is what is defining the result that we're getting for the budget and its, you know, its impact on economic growth. So do I think that it will reach the forecasts that they've set? No, I don't think it will. I think, you know, economic conditions are going to continue to be soft, which means that some, you know, automatic stabilisers may kick in, or the RBA kicks in with some interest rate changes. But again, we'll need to wait and see. But the point of all of this is we have an opinion. Yeah. And ultimately, at the end of your essay, right, at the end of your paragraph in analysing, what you want to be doing is trying to tie it up with a bit of the overall outcome that you expect, right? Because that's going to really differentiate the response, your response from your peers. So that is it for our first episode of the HSC Economics review. If you have any questions, right, about, you know, the budget and about its impact on economic growth, or about, you know, economics generally, leave a comment below. We love to help and support you. Additionally, Terry and I lead our HSC Economics classes here at ArtofSmart. So if you think, damn, I'm screwed for HSC Economics and I need some insight, or maybe you're doing really well and you're like, I want to differentiate myself and I want to take myself up a level, then get in touch with us. You can work with Terry and myself each week in our classes at ArtofSmart. Stay tuned. If you haven't hit the subscribe button, we will bring you further videos with more economic updates and cutting analysis, I think. I don't think we held back today on you know, economic policy and changes in our future videos every single month. So we will see you in a month.
See ya.